Imagine you are standing in the blinding heat of a Middle Eastern desert.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, and the year is roughly 586 BC.
Oh, wow. Right at the fall of Jerusalem?
Spot on. You are starving. Your city is basically a smoldering pile of ash behind you, and an invading army has just chained you to the person next to you.
That is a horrifying position to be in.
It really is. And then the order is given to march. You are facing a trek of hundreds of miles across some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet, heading all the way toward Babylon.
Right, and in that ancient, brutal reality, the calculus of survival is incredibly simple.
Simple and, well, incredibly cruel.
Very true. The strong might survive the march, to become slave labor for the empire.
Right.
But the weak, the injured, the elderly, they are just left in the sand.
Yeah, that was the universal, undisputed law of ancient warfare.
It was a ruthless filter, honestly. If you could not maintain the pace, the empire had zero use for you.
You are a total liability.
Absolutely. The entire logic of the ancient world relied on the survival of the fittest, the most vigorous, the most capable.
And yet, when we open the historical document we're looking at today, that entire ruthless logic just gets flipped completely upside down.
It really does.
The absolute guarantee of survival and safe return is handed directly to the very people the ancient world would have, discarded without a second thought.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is. Welcome to Reformed Thinking. I'm so glad you are here listening today.
This is going to be a fascinating discussion.
Oh, for sure. This is a deep dive into a single, highly specific, and utterly fascinating historical text.
Yeah, we are looking at a sermon delivered in 1855 by the legendary British preacher Charles H. Spurgeon.
The title is A Promise for the Blind, and it is based on the ancient text of Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 8.
Right, and the occasion for this address is really what makes it so gripping, I think.
Yeah, he delivered it on behalf of the Christian Blind Relief Society.
Which anchors this soaring theological rhetoric in a very gritty, practical reality.
Oh, absolutely. He is not standing in some pristine academic hall debating abstract concepts.
No, not at all. He is standing in the smog and noise of 19th century London.
Right, trying to convince people to open their wallets to buy actual food and coal for the blind residents of his city.
So our mission for this deep dive is to figure out how Spurgeon manages to bridge these completely different worlds.
How does he take ancient prophecy from 500 BC connected to the daily struggles of physical and mental frailty in Victorian London?
And use it to demand urgent Christian charity.
Yes. And here is the real kicker. He does all of this while holding a rigid, uncompromising view of sovereign grace.
That tension is the engine driving this entire text, honestly.
It really is.
How do you harmonize an absolute belief that God dictates every single outcome in the universe with, well, a passionate plea for human beings to take immediate action to help their starving neighbors?
It is a philosophical tightrope walk.
Oh, for sure.
So whether you are listening because you love theology, or you are a massive history nerd, or you are just curious about how human beings process and categorize suffering, you are going to find so much value here.
There are some wild anecdotes in this text.
Oh my goodness, yes. We are going to talk about bizarre folklore involving underground travel.
Right, and snails boarding Noah's Ark.
I love the snails. We are going to see how those odd details make massive theological concepts incredibly concrete.
So let's set the stage. Where does Spurgeon actually begin his argument?
Well, he begins with the literal historical nightmare we talked about in the intro.
Right, the setting is Israel as a displaced nation.
Spurgeon points out that this nation had experienced wild highs and devastating lows.
But right now, in the text of Jeremiah, they have hit rock bottom.
They are prisoners of war. And Spurgeon paints this vivid, mournful picture.
He really leans into the emotion of it. He talks about them dwelling in a land that is not their own.
Yeah, they hear a foreign language everywhere they go.
They are surrounded by fierce enemies who worship different gods, and they are forced to witness idolatrous rituals.
He brings in the famous lament from Psalm 137. Right?
Yes. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion.
They have literally hung their harps on the willow trees.
And why? Because their captors are actively mocking them.
It is so cruel. The Babylonians are demanding that these broken, defeated people sing the joyful songs of Jerusalem for their entertainment.
Think about the psychological devastation of that moment.
I mean, you are miles from home, totally traumatized.
And the people who literally burned your house down are taunting you, asking for a musical performance.
It is awful. But into that specific, suffocating despair, a promise drops from the sky.
Right, God sends a prophet to say, I'm going to bring you back. I will gather you from the coasts of the earth.
But the truly shocking part of the promise is the guest list.
Oh, definitely. The text highlights who is at the front of this return parade.
The verse explicitly names the blind, the lame, the woman with child, and the woman in labor.
Okay, let's stop and think about the sheer logistics of that for a second.
Yeah, let's look at any modern mass evacuation, whether it is a hurricane response or fleeing a war zone.
The absolute most difficult part of the operation is always moving the vulnerable.
Oh, for sure. You need specialized transport, medical support.
You need a very slow, deliberate pace to move the elderly, the injured, or expectant mothers.
Now strip away the helicopters, the paved highways, and the modern medicine.
Apply that operation to the ancient Near East.
Right. A return from exile meant walking hundreds of miles across hostile, barren terrain.
Normally, only the absolute elite, like the strongest, most resilient individuals would have any hope of surviving the trip.
They would be the only ones to see their homeland again.
So, for the prophet to promise that the frail and the disabled will be the ones leading the charge, that is a massive flex of divine provision.
It really is. How does Spurgeon take this ancient historical reality and use it to build his broader argument?
He uses it to redefine how we view physical limitations.
Interesting. How so?
Well, in the natural order, being blind or lame automatically disqualifies you from a grueling desert march.
Right.
But because God explicitly names them, Spurgeon argues that human limitations do not disqualify anyone from divine restoration.
Oh, I see.
In fact, he makes a really brilliant psychological point.
What is that?
He says if the prophet had not specifically named the blind and the lame, those vulnerable individuals would have naturally assumed the promise was not for them.
Oh, wow. They would have assumed they were being left behind.
I mean, yes, spot on.
Yeah.
Because the world always leaves the weak behind.
That is the default human experience right there.
But this promise completely subverts that.
If the blind and the lame are guaranteed to survive the desert, then the success of the trip relies 0% on the strength of the person walking.
Right, and 100% on the strength of the one doing the gathering.
Yes, the physical logistics guarantee the theological point.
The preservation of the most vulnerable people in the population becomes the ultimate proof of a sovereign hand orchestrating the entire event.
It is a stunning historical anchor.
It is.
But then, Spurgeon throws a massive curveball.
He really does. He does not stay in Babylon at all.
No, he suddenly leaps forward in time to what he calls a further prophetical signification.
He starts talking about the end of the world.
Yeah, he shifts from the historical Babylonian exile to his eschatological view, his framework for the latter days.
He explicitly states his firm belief that before Jesus Christ returns to earth, the Jewish people will be gathered from all over the globe.
And permitted to return to Palestine.
Now, we have to look at the calendar here.
Right, he delivered this address in 1855.
That is decades before Theodore Herzl and the modern Zionist movement gained any real political traction.
And it is nearly a century before the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948.
So it is a fascinating historical artifact.
Definitely. He notes that, in his current time of 1855, they are only standing at the entrance gates of this promise.
But he is absolutely convinced that a literal gathering is on the horizon.
He predicts that old Zion will be rebuilt. The temple will resound with worship again.
And it will all culminate in what he calls latter-day glory.
To prove how intense this longing runs, he shares some wild cultural anecdotes from 19th century London.
Yes, this is the folklore you teased earlier. The details he includes are striking.
Tell us about the dirt.
Okay, so he talks about a practice where Jewish people in England would have soil from Palestine sealed by the chief rabbi, brought over just to be buried with them.
That's amazing.
He says even if it was just enough dirt to cover a small 6-pence coin, it brought them immense comfort.
A pinch of dirt the size of a coin.
Yeah.
But that tiny amount of earth carried a massive cultural and theological weight.
It did. And then he mentions an even wilder belief.
Right, he calls it a falsehood, but he shares it anyway because it illustrates their intense love for their homeland.
He says there's a belief that any Jewish person who died in a foreign land would travel underground.
Literally through the earth.
Yes, directly through the earth to arrive in Palestine.
If you look at the sociology of displaced peoples, you can see why a myth like that develops.
Oh, absolutely. When an entire population is exiled, the human psyche demands a physical connection to the promised land.
Right, if the political reality prevents them from traveling there while they are alive.
The culture develops a narrative where the earth itself opens up a hidden corridor for them in death.
Spurgeon dismisses the literal truth of the underground travel, of course.
But he respects the intense yearning it represents.
He also slips in some very pointed socio-political commentary here.
Yes, he does. He argues that Jewish people should not be fettered or oppressed in any way.
He explicitly states they ought to have a vote in Parliament and be freed from all civil disabilities.
Now, that was a highly controversial political stance in mid-19th century Britain.
For sure. The Jewish Relief Act didn't pass until 1858.
Right. That was the act that finally allowed Jewish members of parliament to take their oaths without being forced to say, on the true faith of a Christian.
And that is 3 years after Spurgeon gave this address.
So he is taking a definitive, progressive civic stance for his era.
But he pairs that civic stance with a rigid theological prediction.
Yeah, he says they should be completely free and have the vote, yet he insists they will never amalgamate or blend in with other nations.
He believes they are a scattered people who will remain entirely distinct.
Until they suddenly rise, touched by the Spirit of God, to secure the treasures of paradise instead of financial gain.
And he ties this prediction right back to the verse in Jeremiah.
He says if this future gathering to Jerusalem happens, the blind Jew and the lame Jew will as surely make the trip as any of the young, vigorous ones.
The ancient promise holds steady across the centuries.
So Spurgeon spends a significant amount of time building this prophetic case.
He lays out the history, the politics, the future predictions.
And then he just drops it.
Yeah, completely abruptly. He leaves the topic behind, admitting, I know very little of them.
And he decides to look at the text from a completely different angle.
It is a classic rhetorical pivot.
He uses the literal historical return from Babylon and the predicted future return to Palestine as a springboard.
To launch into a topic he claims to know intimately, the spiritual application.
Right. He shifts the focus entirely away from a literal nation and places it on what he calls God's peculiar people.
Yes, the spiritual elect. This is where his Reformed theology really takes center stage.
He defines this group with very distinct theological markers.
He describes them as a called and elected people, chosen by the Father before the foundation of the world.
He builds on that, adding that they are a redeemed people, purchased by the blood of Jesus.
And a sanctified people,
Yeah.
separated by God from the rest of mankind.
So we have the Father choosing, the Son purchasing, and the Spirit separating.
It is a complete, airtight system of salvation based entirely on divine action.
The human being does not initiate any of this.
And the promise he extracts from Jeremiah is that every single one of these chosen individuals will be brought to Mount Zion.
Which he now equates with heaven.
He uses this great agricultural metaphor, saying God's wheat shall all be gathered into God's garner.
This creates a fascinating dynamic regarding the blind and the lame in this new spiritual context.
How do you mean?
Well, if the gathering is no longer a physical march to a geographic city, but a spiritual gathering to heaven.
Then the physical ailments of blindness and lameness become metaphors for human inability.
Spot on.
Wait, if you are listening to this, the shift from a literal nation crossing a desert to a spiritually elect group going to heaven might feel like a massive, disconnected leap.
Oh, sure.
Why does Spurgeon think he can just apply this text to his own congregation?
Within his theological framework, it makes perfect logical sense. It is an argument from the lesser to the greater.
Okay, break that down for us.
If God has the capacity to guarantee the physical arrival of a vulnerable, lame person across a deadly desert, that historical fact acts as a proof of concept.
Right.
It proves God has the capability to guarantee the spiritual arrival of a helpless sinner into heaven.
Oh, I love that. The physical rescue validates the spiritual rescue.
Precisely. Spurgeon brings in the concept of the two Adams to explain this inability.
For anyone unfamiliar with federal headship, how does that work?
Think of it like corporate liability.
Okay.
If the CEO of a massive company makes a disastrous illegal gamble and bankrupts the firm, every employee loses their pension.
Right.
The mailroom clerk did not make the bad trade, but because the CEO acted as the representative head of the company, everyone suffers the consequences.
In Reformed theology, the first Adam acted as a representative for all humanity.
Yes. When he rebelled, he bankrupted the human race, bringing in the infirmities Spurgeon laments, lameness, blindness, deafness, and, well, death.
But then Spurgeon gives all the honor to the second Adam, referring to Jesus.
Right. If the first CEO bankrupted the company, the second CEO steps in.
He pays off the massive debt with his own capital. and shares the new prophets with the employees.
Jesus overcomes the infirmities caused by the first Adam.
And Spurgeon uses this to explain why God specifically calls the weak.
He points out that human armies do not draft blind men.
Yeah, you do not send a blind man to the front lines.
But in the army of God, the draft board works differently.
He says God enlists many blind warriors and makes them his best soldiers.
The underlying logic is beautiful.
It really is. Human weakness is not an obstacle to divine grace.
No, it is actually the preferred canvas for it to be displayed.
The entire process relies solely on the sovereign choice and redemptive work of the divine, completely bypassing human merit.
So having established exactly who is going to heaven, Spurgeon then breaks down the specific categories of helplessness you find on this road.
And he does this using a really clever rhetorical device.
He takes his audience on a mental walking tour of 19th century London.
He uses the actual buildings on the London Road to illustrate three distinct classes of blindness.
I love the geography of this illustration.
It is so good. He stands in his pulpit and mentally points his congregation down the road.
First, he points to the school for the blind, representing physical blindness.
Then he points further down to Bedlam Hospital, representing mental blindness.
And finally, he points to the Roman Catholic Cathedral, representing spiritual blindness.
Let's walk down that road with him, starting with the first building.
The school for the physically blind.
He traces physical afflictions straight back to the fall in the Garden of Eden.
But he immediately moves to offer intense comfort.
Yes, he promises that physical blindness does not exclude anyone from heaven.
He creates this incredibly vivid image of what happens at the threshold of heaven.
Oh, this part is so moving. He says a man might go through his entire life leaning heavily on a crutch, dragging a withered limb.
But he is not turned away at heaven's door because he has crutches.
No. The absolute second he crosses the threshold, God speaks the word.
The withered limb instantly regains its strength.
And the dim eye gets its luster back.
He assures them there are no furrows of pain or age on the brows of the glorified.
The frail physical body is exchanged for a spiritual, immortal one, clothed in light.
To drive this home, he specifically mentions John Milton,
calling him the blind bard of paradise.
He points out that when Milton lost his physical eyesight, his internal vision opened up to see things others had never even imagined.
He's asserting that physical deprivation can actually create a unique kind of spiritual sight.
By losing his temporal vision, Milton was forced to look inward and upward,
seeing far into the deep things of God.
Spurgeon is comforting the physically blind by assuring them that their current dark reality is temporary.
And their future reality is glorious and bright.
Then the walking tour continues down the London Road to the second building.
Bedlam.
This was the notorious psychiatric hospital of the era, and it represents the mentally blind.
Now, Spurgeon carefully avoids getting bogged down in the theological debate about individuals who have completely lost all reason.
Yeah, he says debating their eternal state would cause a great deal of argument without yielding any practical result.
Which is probably a smart pastoral move.
Oh, very smart. Instead, he focuses on what he calls practical mental blindness.
He's talking about people with weak mental faculties or people who simply never had access to education.
We have to understand how radical this was for his time.
How so?
In the 19th century, mental illness and lack of education were often viewed as moral failings or signs of divine disfavor.
Bedlam itself was historically a place of horrific abuse, where patients were treated like sideshow attractions.
Exactly. By addressing the mentally blind with such dignity, Spurgeon is pushing back against the elitism of his culture.
He acknowledges that everyone has imperfect vision.
He makes a quick joke that the only person on earth who claims to be infallible is the Pope, which just proves the Pope is more blind than the rest of us.
That is such a classic 1855 Protestant jab.
It is, but his main point is incredibly reassuring for the working class, uneducated people in his pews.
He insists that heaven does not have an entrance exam.
You do not need a giant intellect, a mastermind, or a fruitful imagination to grasp the gospel.
He quotes a specific scripture to back this up, right?
Yes. The wayfaring men, though fools, shall not err therein.
This strikes at the very core of Reformed thinking.
It really does.
Yeah.
If salvation required high intelligence or complex philosophical understanding,
then salvation would essentially be based on human merit.
It would be a reward for being smart.
By insisting that the most uneducated person can easily understand the core of the gospel, he proves that grace entirely bypasses human intellectual achievement.
He shares this wonderful, funny anecdote to illustrate the point.
Oh, the story about the old woman.
Yes. He talks about an uneducated old woman who sat through a highly complex, confusing sermon on metaphysics.
The minister was using all sorts of massive academic words,
Afterward, someone asked her what she thought.
and she called it a blessed sermon because she thought the minister said the Savior was both meat and physic too.
Now, physic is an old Victorian word for medicine.
It is a perfect, beautiful mistake.
She completely misunderstood the complex philosophical vocabulary the minister was actually using.
But in her misunderstanding, she grasped the fundamental theological truth perfectly.
Right, Jesus provides both daily sustenance, the meat, and healing, the medicine.
Spurgeon says there will be people in heaven who never read a single word in their entire lives.
The substance of the gospel is remarkably simple. He that believeth and is baptized shall be saved.
So we have visited the first two buildings.
Both physical blindness and mental blindness are met with immediate comfort, reassurance, and promises of total restoration.
The physical body gets healed at the gates of heaven, and the uneducated mind gets a free pass because divine grace is simple.
But then we arrive at the third building on the London Road.
And this category of blindness is entirely different. It presents a severe, lethal danger.
We are talking about the spiritually blind.
Spurgeon identifies these individuals as anyone who lacks the illuminating work of the Holy Spirit.
And he casts an extremely wide net when he defines who falls into this category.
He really does. He starts pointing fingers at specific theological camps.
He names the Puseyites.
For context, the Puseyites were part of the Oxford movement in the Church of England, led by Edward Pusey.
Right, they wanted to bring high church, Catholic-style rituals back into the Anglican Church.
And Spurgeon heavily opposed that.
Then he names the Arminians.
These were the theological descendants of Jacobus Arminius.
They argued for human free will and the ability to resist grace,
which directly opposed Spurgeon's strict Calvinist belief in absolute predestination.
He also names the Church of Rome.
But he does not stop at his theological rivals. He points right at his own congregation.
He says there are regular chapel-goers, people sitting in the pews every Sunday, who have the form of godliness without any of the internal vitality.
They know the songs, they know the liturgy, but they are completely blind.
He defines their deadly condition by listing exactly what they cannot see.
They do not see their lost, ruined state by nature.
They do not understand the sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice, acting as a mediator.
And they know absolutely nothing about a vital, living union with the person of Christ.
Without the Holy Spirit actively opening their eyes, they are fumbling in the dark.
He uses some striking imagery from nature to drive this home.
He compares nominal cultural Christians to bats that only know how to fly at night.
Or owls that are completely blinded when the daylight finally comes.
They are structurally, fundamentally incapable of navigating the light of truth.
This is where those strict theological boundaries become incredibly visible.
For sure. For the physically and mentally blind, the promise of entry to Zion is a comfort.
But without the Holy Ghost actively removing the scales from their spiritual eyes, the spiritually blind are completely exposed to the judgment of God.
There is no automatic entrance to heaven for this third category. Illumination is a hard, absolute prerequisite.
But here is where the text introduces a truly fascinating tension.
Spurgeon holds this firm, unyielding doctrinal stance, condemning the wrong principles of these groups.
Yet, in the very next breath, he mandates a remarkably gentle, loving treatment of the individuals who actually hold those wrong principles.
He is very explicit about this tension.
He heavily criticizes the bitter, aggressive spirit that often infects religious debates.
He says we seem bent on forcing people to submit to our views immediately, by any means necessary.
And he calls that approach dead wrong.
He gives practical advice. He says sick men will not take your medicine if you mix it with vinegar.
You have to give it to them with something sweet.
Think about the logic he is applying here.
Yeah, if you are walking down the street and you see a man who is literally, physically blind walking toward a cliff, how do you help him?
Screaming at him to see better doesn't work.
Beating him with a stick doesn't give him his sight back.
Spurgeon is applying that exact physical reality to spiritual debates.
If you truly believe, as a Reformed Christian, that only God can open a spiritually blind eye, then screaming at someone in a theological argument is completely irrational.
You have to provide the sweet medicine of grace, present the truth clearly.
And know that the actual results are entirely out of your hands.
Right. The theology dictates the methodology.
Because God is sovereign over the outcome, the human messenger is freed from the pressure to manipulate or bully the listener into agreement.
So we have extensively covered the three types of blindness.
But we cannot forget that the verse in Jeremiah also explicitly mentions the lame.
And Spurgeon provides a very thorough diagnosis for this condition as well.
The lame represent Christians who are fully on the right road, their eyes are open, but they are struggling intensely to walk the path.
He breaks the lame down into two distinct subcategories.
Those with weak faith and backsliders.
To describe the people with weak faith, he quotes a man named Joseph Irons.
Irons said these people keep hoping, hopping all their lives because they can't walk.
It is such a vivid, almost cartoonish picture of a believer who lacks the full assurance of their salvation.
They are constantly doubting, constantly anxious, constantly limping along instead of walking in confidence.
And to comfort these anxious, limping believers, Spurgeon brings out what might be the greatest, most unexpected analogy in the entire document.
Oh, I love this part so much.
He starts talking about the animals entering Noah's Ark.
Specifically, he focuses on the snails.
It is pure pastoral comedy.
He says 2 snails entered the ark. How they managed to get there, he cannot tell.
It must have taken them a massive amount of time.
He jokes that they must have started their journey rather early unless Noah took pity on them and carried them part of the way.
The sheer absurdity of the image is what makes it so effective.
Imagine the chaos of the flood approaching, the massive animals rushing up the ramp.
And down at the bottom are these 2 snails moving at a microscopic, agonizing pace.
They are entirely vulnerable to being crushed.
Yet they arrive at the exact same salvation, inside the exact same ark as the racing horse or the soaring eagle.
Spurgeon says, little faith is always lame, but they still arrive.
It is such a massive relief for the anxious listener.
The pace of your travel does not dictate the security of your destination.
Your weak faith might make the trip miserable, but it does not disqualify you from the ark.
But then he has to tackle the second category of the lame, the backsliders.
And here he has to walk a very fine theological line.
He is dealing with the concept of falling from grace.
Right, he asserts the Reformed doctrine of the perseverance of the saints.
He states unequivocally that God's people cannot fall finally.
He says grace will complete what grace begins.
Once you are chosen and purchased, you cannot be unchosen or unpurchased.
But he immediately qualifies that comforting doctrine by warning his congregation that a believer can still fall a very, very long way.
He uses a visceral, physical comparison to explain the difference.
He says a Christian may fall into sin and break a limb, but they cannot fall spiritually and break their neck.
The distinction is between a grievous, painful injury and fatal, eternal destruction.
The consequence of backsliding, of living in unrepentant sin, is not ultimate damnation for the chosen.
However, it results in severe misery, loss of joy, and intense unhappiness in this present life.
The salvation is secure, but the experience of life becomes a nightmare.
He uses King David from the Old Testament as the prime example of this.
David was a man after God's own heart, but he fell into a massive public sin.
And while his soul remained secure in the covenant, the rest of his earthly life was filled with absolute chaos.
He faced rebellious sons, betrayals, and constant enemies.
The broken limb hurt him every time it rained for the rest of his days.
But the text rejoices that, in the end, sorrowing backsliders will not be left behind in Babylon.
They will be restored, their limbs will be healed, and they will be found among the followers at the final gathering.
Having spent all this time diagnosing the exact conditions of the blind and the lame and explaining the theological mechanics of how they are saved, the text finally shifts to its practical application.
This is where the 19th century boots hit the cobblestones.
He has built the framework. Now he demands to know what the listener is actually supposed to do about all this frailty.
He outlines 3 specific, actionable duties that correspond directly to the 3 types of blindness we walk past on the London Road.
First, he addresses our duty to the spiritually blind.
The primary duty is to pray for them.
He is incredibly blunt here. He says if you do not pray for the spiritually blind, he cannot believe you actually care about them at all.
He shares a deeply compelling story to illustrate this.
He talks about an infidel, a skeptic, who told a Christian man that he didn't believe the Christian actually believed his own Bible.
The Christian was offended and shocked, but the skeptic explained his reasoning.
He said, I pass you in going to my business every day, and you have never spoken to me concerning my soul. If you believe the Bible, you are very unfeeling.
It is a devastating critique of hypocrisy.
If you truly believe someone is walking blindly toward a cliff and you walk past them every morning in silence, Your actions completely contradict your stated theology.
You either do not believe the cliff is there, or you do not care if they fall.
Spurgeon then turns this exact same critique toward his fellow ministers in the pulpit.
He complains bitterly about preachers who stand up and read good-for-nothing manuscripts without any intense, burning love for the souls of their listeners.
He demands what he calls a golden link of sympathy between the minister in the pulpit and the people sitting in the pews.
Which perfectly sets up the second duty, directed toward the mentally blind, those who are uneducated or struggle to understand.
The duty here is to be charitable and to instruct them patiently.
He reiterates the point we discussed earlier. You cannot force human belief.
He quotes an old rhyme, "Convince a man against his will, he's of the same opinion still."
He uses another brilliant analogy to explain how we should instruct the mentally blind. The lantern versus the truncheon.
A truncheon being a police baton.
He says when a policeman meets a man wandering in the dark at night, he turns his lantern straight upon the man's eyes to see who he is and guide him.
He doesn't pull out his truncheon to thrash him.
We must shine the light of truth clearly, not beat people over the head in endless debates.
Again, it is a highly rational approach derived directly from his theology.
If God alone possesses the ability to open blind eyes, then prayer is the only logical first response.
If divine grace is unconditional and actively bypasses human intellect, then patience with those who do not understand is absolutely mandatory.
You shine the light of the lantern, but you drop the club.
Finally, we reach the third duty, and this is the immediate practical reason for the entire gathering.
The duty to the physically blind.
He looks at his audience and tells them they need to give practical financial relief week by week to the Relief Society.
And to justify why God allows physical blindness to exist in the first place, he constructs a wild hypothetical scenario.
He asks his audience to use their imaginations. Imagine if another globe were created and rolled up right alongside this world.
What if God took all the sick, the blind, the lame, and the helpless, and moved them to that other planet, just to rid this world of suffering?
Spurgeon argues that true Christians would immediately want them back.
He says if there were no poor or suffering people, you'd complain, here is this shilling. I don't know what to do with it. I have no way of doing good.
He actually says God intentionally leaves the poor and the blind on earth to give the church the treat of doing something for them.
We have to pause here, because to modern ears, calling charity a treat sounds incredibly harsh.
It can sound almost transactional or even dismissive of the actual agonizing suffering of the poor.
It sounds like he's arguing that poor people exist just to provide moral exercise for the wealthy.
But if we analyze this statement through the lens of divine providence, a completely different picture emerges.
I push back on that kind of language when I read it. It feels like it minimizes the pain of blindness just to make the rich feel good about tossing a coin in a bucket. How do we reconcile this idea of charity as a treat with his genuine, passionate plea for the Relief Society?
You have to look at how Reformed theology views the concept of means.
Okay, break that down.
In a universe where every single outcome is dictated by a sovereign power, the existence of suffering is not a random accident or a failure of the system.
Right.
Spurgeon views the act of giving charity not as a burdensome tax, but as a divinely sanctioned opportunity to tangibly evidence your love for Christ.
It is a system of mutual sanctification.
Yes. The poor person receives the necessary physical sustenance to survive, and the giver receives the spiritual benefit of acting in the character of Jesus.
He asserts very strongly that a church with no poor people in it is a sinking ship.
The poor anchor the church to reality and compassion.
He brings it right to their doorstep. He says Jesus Christ himself stands at the door of the chapel as they retire for the evening,
Asking, "Give me somewhat this night if you love me."
It brings the massive cosmic theological scope of the sermon right down to the physical offering plate at the back of the room.
It is a masterful rhetorical structure. Think about the ground he has covered.
He takes his audience from the weeping, traumatized captives of ancient Babylon,
Through the cosmic, eternal decrees of divine election and perseverance,
across the physical geography of London's hospitals and cathedrals,
and lands them squarely on the immediate pressing necessity of opening their physical wallets for the Christian Blind Relief Society.
The scope is truly staggering.
We have covered the literal logistics of surviving in ancient exile,
The prophetic hope of a scattered people longing for dirt from Palestine,
the theological mechanisms of grace that completely bypass human intellect,
and the practical, daily demands of a lantern-wielding, sweet medicine-giving charity.
And underlying every single one of those points is the constant, steady assumption that human frailty is never an impediment to divine promises.
Whether it is the lame leg dragging behind, the uneducated mind struggling to understand, or the snail-like pace of weak faith.
The frailty is the very condition that makes the grace visible.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over.
We have spent this time dissecting how a 19th century preacher categorized the blind and the lame.
But Spurgeon argues that the very limitations you probably despise in yourself, your weak faith, your slow intellect, your constant hopping progress where you feel like you are never getting anywhere, are the exact conditions God uses.
He uses them to guarantee that your arrival at the destination is entirely to his credit.
It completely reorients the entire concept of personal weakness.
It turns a liability into a proof of concept.
It really does. So the question is this. If you start viewing your own frailty not as a barrier keeping you from your destination, but as the very proof that you must be carried there.
How does that change the way you view the limps and the blind spots in the people you interact with tomorrow morning?
When someone frustrates you with their slow progress or their lack of understanding, do you pull out a truncheon to beat them, or do you shine a lantern to guide them?
A fantastic question to carry forward into the week.
We will leave it right there for today. Thank you for walking the London Road with us, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.